Chapter 54. Augustus spent half the first day finding tracks, for Blue Duck had been cool enough to lead Lorena through the stampeding cattle, so that their tracks would be blotted out by the thousands of cattle tracks. It was a fine trick. Not many men would dare to try. Years had passed since Augustus had done any serious tracking. He rode around all morning, trying to remember the last man he had tracked, just to give himself perspective. It seemed to him that the last man had been an incompetent horse thief named Webster Witter, who had rustled horses in the Blanco country at one time. He and Call had gone after him one day by themselves and caught him and hung him before sundown, but the tracking had been elemental due to the fact that the man had been driving 40 stolen horses. The thing he remembered best about Webster Witter was that he'd been a tall man, and they caught him out in the scrub and had to hang him to a short tree. It was that or take him back, and Call was against taking him back. Call believed summary justice was often the only justice, and in those days he was right, since they had to depend on circuit judges who often as not didn't show up. If we take him back, he'll bribe the jailer or dig out or something, and we'll have to catch him at it again, Call said. It never occurred to Call to just shoot someone he could hang, and in this instance Augustus didn't suggest it, for they had rushed out without much ammunition and were traveling in rough country. Fortunately, Webster's neck broke when they whipped the horse out from under him, otherwise he could have stood there and laughed at them, for the limb of the mesquite sagged badly and both his feet drug on the ground. If we take him back, he'll bribe the jailer or dig out or something, and we'll have to catch him at it again, Call said. It never occurred to Call to just shoot someone he could hang, and in this instance Augustus didn't suggest it, for they had rushed out without much ammunition and were traveling in rough country. Fortunately, Webster's neck broke when they whipped the horse out from under him. Otherwise, he could have stood there and laughed at them, for the limb of the mesquite sagged badly, and both his feet drug the ground. That had been at least 12 years ago, and Augustus soon concluded that his tracking skills had rusted to the point of being unusable. The only horse tracks he found for the first 3 hours belonged to Hat Creek horses. He almost decided to go back and get Dietz, though he knew Call would be reluctant to surrender him. Finally, by circling wide to the northwest, Augustus crossed the 3 horse tracks. Blue Duck had tried one trick, crossing the stampede, but that was all. After that, the tracks bore straight for the northwest, so unerringly that Augustus soon found he didn't need to pay much attention to them. If he lost them, he could usually pick them up within a half-mile. He rode as hard as he dared, but he had only one horse and couldn't afford to ruin him. At each watering, he let him have a few minutes of rest. He rode all night, and the next day the tracks were still bearing northwest. He felt unhappy with himself, for he wasn't catching up. Lorena was getting a taste of hard travel, the like of which she had never imagined. Probably she would have worse to deal with than hard travel unless she was very lucky, and Augustus knew it was his fault. They should have packed her into camp the minute he discovered who Blue Duck was. In retrospect, he couldn't imagine why he hadn't. It was the kind of lapse he had been subject to all his life. Things that were clearly dangerous didn't worry him enough. He tried to swallow his regrets and concentrate on finding her. After all, it had happened, and why he had let it no longer particularly mattered. Blue Duck was a name from their past. Having him show up in the midst 15 years later had thrown his reasoning off. The second day he stopped tracking altogether, since it was plain Blue Duck was heading for the Staked Plains. That took in a lot of territory, of course, but Augustus thought he knew where Blue Duck would go, to an area north and west of the Palo Duro Canyon. It was there he had always retreated to when he pursued. Once Call and he had sat on the western edge of the Great Canyon looking across the brown waterless distance to the west. They had finally decided to end their pursuit there, well, they had a fair chance of getting back alive. It wasn't Indians they feared so much as lack of water. It had been midsummer and the plains looked seared. What grass there was brown and brittle. Call was frustrated. He hated to turn back before he caught his man. "There's got to be water out there," Call said. "They cross it and they can't drink dirt." "Yeah, but they know where it is and we don't," Augustus pointed out. "They can kill their horses getting to it. They got more horses, but if we kill ours, it's a darn long walk back to San Antonio." That afternoon he crossed the clear fork of the Brazos and passed a half-built cabin abandoned and empty. It was a vivid enough reminder of the power of the Comanches. Their massacres caused plenty of settlers to retreat while they still had legs to retreat on. Call and he had watched through the 50s as the line of frontier advanced only to collapse soon after. The men and women who came up the Trinity and the Brazos were no strangers to hardship. But hardship was one thing, terror another. The land was spacious and theirs for the taking, but land couldn't cancel out fear, a fact that Call never understood. It annoyed him that the whites gave up and retreated. "I wish they'd stick," he said so many times. "If they would, there'd soon enough be enough of them to beat back the Indians." "You ain't never laid in bed all night with a scared woman," Augustus said. "You can't start a farm if you got to live in a fort. Them that starts the farms have to settle off by themselves, which means they're easy to cut off and carve up." "Well, they could leave for the women for a while," Call said. "Send for them when it's safe." "Yeah, but a man that goes to the trouble to take a wife don't generally want to go off and leave her," Augustus pointed out. "It means doing the chores all by yourself. Besides, without a wife handy, you won't get no kids. And kids are a wonderful source of free labor. It's cheaper than slaves by a damn sight." They had argued the point for years, but fruitlessly, for Call had no sympathy for human weakness. Augustus put it down to lack of imagination. Call could never imagine what it was like to be scared. They'd been in tight spots, but usually that meant action, and in battle things happened too fast to fear to paralyze the mind of a man like Call. He couldn't imagine what it was like to go to bed every night scared that you and your family would feel the knives of the Comanches before sunrise. That night Augustus stopped to rest his horse, making a cold camp on a little bluff and eating some jerky he had brought along. He was in the scrubby post oak country near the Brazos, and from his bluff could see far across the moonlit valleys. It struck him that he had forgotten emptiness such as existed in the country that stretched around him. After all, for years he had lived within the sound of the piano from the dry bean, the sound of the church bell in the little Lonesome Dove church, the sound of bull whacking the dinner bell. He even slept within the sound of P.I.'s snoring, which was as regular as the ticking of a clock. But here there was no sound. Not any. The coyotes were silent, the crickets, the locusts, the owls. There was only the sound of his own horse grazing. From him to the stars in all directions there was only silence and emptiness. Not the talk of men over their cards, nothing. Though he had ridden hard, he felt strangely rested just from the silence. Next day he found the carcass of Laurie's mare. By the end of the day he was out of the scrub. When he crossed the Wichita he angled west. He had not seen Blue Duck's tracks in 2 days, but he didn't care. He'd always had confidence in his instincts and felt he knew where the man would stop. Possibly he was bound for Adobe Walls, one of the Bent's old forts. This one on the Canadian had never been much of a success. The Bents had abandoned it, and it became a well-known gathering place for buffalo hunters as well as for anyone crossing the plains. It was spring. What few buffalo were left would be moving north, and what buffalo hunters were left would be gathered at the old fort getting ready for the last hide harvest. Buffalo hunters were not known to be too particular about their company, though Blue Duck and his men had picked off plenty of them over the years. The new crop would probably overlook the fact if he turned up with a prize like Lorena. Also, there were still renegade bands of Kiowas and Comanches loose on the plains. The bands were supposedly scattered, at least that was the talk in South Texas, and the trade in captives virtually dead. But Augustus wasn't in South Texas anymore, and as he rode through the empty country, he had plenty of time to consider that maybe the talk hadn't been all that accurate. Talk often wasn't. The bands were doomed, but they might last another year or two, whereas he was advancing into their country in the here and now. He wasn't afraid for himself, but he was afraid for Lorena. Blue Duck might be dealing with some renegade chief with a taste for white women. Lorena would put a nice cap on a career largely devoted to stealing children. If Blue Duck intended to trade her to an Indian, he would probably take her farther west through the region known as Kentucky, and then north to a crossing on the Canadian where the Comanches had traded captives for decades. Nearby was the famous Valley of Tears, spoken with anguish by such captives as had been recovered. There the Comanches divided captives, mothers being separated from their children and sold to different bands, the theory being that if they were isolated they would be less likely to organize escapes. As he moved into the Kentucky, a parched country where shallow red canyons stretched west toward the Palo Duro, Augustus would see little spiraling dust devils rising from the exposed earth far ahead of him. During the heat of the day, mirages in the form of flat lakes appeared so vivid that a time or two he almost convinced himself there was water ahead, although he knew there wasn't. He decided to head first for the big crossing on the Canadian. If there was no sign of blue duck there, he could always follow the river over the walls. He crossed the Prairie Dog Fork of the Red River. Plenty of prairie dogs were in evidence, too, and he rode west to the edge of the Palo Duro. Several times he saw small herds of buffalo, and twice rode through valleys of bleached bones placed where hunters had slaughtered several hundred animals at a time. By good luck, he found a spring and spent the night by it, resting his horse for the final push. Late the next day, he came into the breaks of the Canadian, a country of shallow, eroded gullies. He could see where the river curved east, across the plains. He rode east for several miles, hoping to cross Blue Duck's tracks. He didn't, which convinced him he had guessed wrong in coming so far west. The man had probably gone directly to the walls and pitched Lorena into the laps of a bunch of buffalo hunters. Before he had time to lament his error, though, Augustus saw a sight which took his mind off it completely. He saw a speck moving across the plains north toward the river. At first he thought it might be Blue Duck, but if so, he was traveling without Lorena. There was only one speck. His horse saw the speck too. Augustus drew his rifle in case the speck turned out to be hostile. He loped toward it, only to discover an old man with a dirty white beard pushing a wheelbarrow across the plains. The wheelbarrow contained buffalo bones, and if that wasn't unusual enough, Augustus found that he even knew the man. His name was Os Frank, and he had started as a mountain man, trapping beaver. He'd once kept a store in Waco, but for some reason got mad and robbed the bank next to his store. The bank had thought they were getting along with him fine until the day he walked in and robbed them. Augustus and Call were in Waco at the time, and though Call was reluctant to bother with bank robbers, he felt bankers were so stupid they deserved robbing. They were persuaded to go after him. They caught him right away, but not without a gun battle. The battle took place in the thicket of the Brazos, where Os Frank had stopped to cook some venison. It went on for 2 hours and resulted in no injuries. Then Os Frank ran out of ammunition and had been easy enough to arrest. He cursed them all the way back to Waco and broke out of jail the day they left town. Augustus had not heard of him since, yet there he was, wheeling a barrel full of buffalo bones across the high plains. He didn't seem to be armed, so Augustus rode right up to him, keeping his rifle across his saddle. The old robber could well have had a pistol hidden in the bones, though unless his aim improved, he was not much of a threat, even if it did. "Hello, Os," Augustus said as he rode up. "Have you gone in the bone business or what?" The old man squinted at him for a moment, but made no reply. He kept on wheeling his barrel full of bones over the rough ground. Tobacco drippings had stained his beard until most of it was deep brown. "I guess you don't remember me," Augustus said, falling in beside him. "I'm Captain McCrae. We shot at one another all afternoon once up in the Brazos. You was one thicket and me and Call, we was in the next. We pruned the post oaks with all that shooting. We stuck you in jail and you crawled right out again." "I don't like you much," Os Frank said, still trundling. "Put me in goddamn jail." "Well, why'd you rob that bank?" Augustus said. "It ain't Christian to rob your neighbors. It ain't Christian to hold a grudge, neither. Wasn't you born into the Christian religion?" "No," Os Frank said. "What do you want?" "White girl," Augustus said. "Pretty one. An outlaw carried her off. You may know him. His name is Blue Duck." Os Frank stopped the wheelbarrow. He needed to spit. He leaned over and spat a large mouthful of tobacco juice directly into the hole of a red ant bed. The ants annoyed scurried about in all directions. Augustus laughed. Os Frank had always been an original. In Waco, as he remembered, he had caused controversy because he never seemed to sleep. The lantern in his store would be on at all hours of the night, and the man would often be seen roaming the streets 3 a.m. Nobody knew what he was looking for or if he found it. "Now that's a trick," Augustus said, "spitting on them ants. I guess that's all you got to do besides haul bones." Os Frank resumed his walk, and Augustus followed along, amused at the strange turns life took. Soon they came down into the valley of the Canadian. Augustus was amazed to see an enormous pyramid of buffalo bones perhaps 50 yards from the water. The bones were piled so high it seemed to him Os Frank might have a ladder to use in his piling. Though he saw no sign of one, down the river a quarter of a mile there was another pyramid just as large.
Well, Oss, I see you've been busy, Augustus said. You'll be so rich one of these days some bank will come along and rob you. Who do you sell these bones to? Oss Frank ignored the question. While Augustus watched, he pushed his wheelbarrow up to the bottom of the pyramid of bones and began to throw the bones as high as possible up the pyramid. Once or twice he got a leg bone or a thigh bone all the way to the top, but most of the bones hit midway and stuck. In 5 minutes, the big wheelbarrow was empty. Without a word, Oss Frank took the wheelbarrow and started back across the prairie. Augustus decided to rest while the old man worked. Such camp as there was rudimentary. Oss had dug a little cave in one of the red bluffs south of the river, and his gear was piled in front of it. There was a buffalo gun, a few pots and pans, and that was it. The main crossing was a mile downriver. Augustus rode down to inspect it before unsaddling. There were horse tracks galore, but none of those he was looking for. He saw 5 pyramids of bones between the crossing and Oss Frank's camp, each containing several tons of bones. Back at the camp, Augustus rested in the shade of the little bluff. Oss Frank continued to haul in bones until sundown. After pitching his last load up on the pyramid, he wheeled the barrow to his camp, turned it over, and sat on it. He looked at Augustus for 2 or 3 minutes without saying anything. "Well, you going to invite me to supper or not?" Augustus asked. "Never should have arrested me," Oss Frank said. "I don't like that goddamn bank." "You didn't stay in jail but 4 hours," Augustus reminded him. "Now that I've seen how hard you work, I'd say you probably needed the rest. You could have studied English or something. I see you've learned it finally." "I don't like that goddamn bank," Oss repeated. "Let's talk about something else," Augustus suggested. "You're just lucky you didn't get shot on account of that bank. Me and Carl were both fine shots in those days. I think it was the only thing that saved you." "They cheated me because I couldn't talk good," Oss Frank said. "You got a one-track mind, Oss," Augustus said. "You and half of mankind. How long you been up here on the Canadian River?" "I come 5 years," Oss said. "I want a store." "That's fine, but you've outrun the people," Augustus said. "They won't be along for another 10 years or so. I guess that by then you'll have a hell of a stock of buffalo bones. I just hope there's a demand for them." "Had a wagon," Oss Frank said. "Got stole. Apaches got it." "That's so," Augustus said. "I didn't know the Apaches lived around here." "Over by the Pecos," Oss said. "I quit the mountains. Don't like snow." "I'll pass on snow myself when I have the option," Augustus said. "This is a lonely place you settled in, though. Don't the Indians bother you?" "They leave me be," Oss said. "That one you're hunting, he's a mean one. He killed Bob, built a fire under him and let him sizzle. He don't bother me none, though," he added. "Killed Bob and let me be." "Bob who?" "Old Bob. That is who I was in the mountains with," Oss said. "Well, his burning days are over if I find him," Augustus said. "He's quick, Blue Duck," Oss said. "Had some Kiowas with him. They ate my dog." "How many Kiowas?" Augustus asked. "It's a big dog," Oss said. "Killed 2 wolves. I had a few sheep once, but Mexicans run them off." "It's a chancy life out here in the plains," Augustus said. "I bet you get a nice breeze in the winter, too." "Them Kiowas ate that dog," Oss repeated. "Good dog." "Why ain't Blue Duck killed you?" Augustus asked. "Laughs at me," Oss said. "Laughs at my bones. He says he'll kill me when he's ready." "How many Kiowas does he run around with?" Augustus asked again. The old man was evidently not used to having anyone to talk to. His remarks came out a little jerky. "6, Oss Frank said. "Who's over at the walls?" Augustus asked. The old man didn't answer. Darkness had fallen, and Augustus could barely see him sitting on his wheelbarrow. "No beaver in this river," Oss Frank said after several minutes. "No, beaver be foolish to be in this river," Augustus said. "There ain't a tree within 20 miles, and beavers like to gnaw trees. You should have stayed up north if you like beavers." "I'd rather gather these bones," the old man said. "You don't have to get your feet wet." "Did you get to Montana when you was a beaver man?" Augustus waited several minutes for a reply, but the old man never answered. When the moon came up, Augustus saw that he'd fallen asleep sitting on his wheelbarrow, his head fallen over in his arms. Augustus was tired and hungry. He lay where he was, thinking about food, but making no effort to get up and fix any, if there was any food to be fixed. While he was thinking he ought to get up and eat, he fell asleep. Deep in the night, a sound disturbed him, and he came awake and drew his pistol. It It was well on toward morning, he could tell by the moon, but the sound was new to him. Cautiously he turned over, only to see once that the source of the sound was Os Frank. He had risen in the night and collected another load of buffalo bones. Now he was heaving them up on the pyramid. That sound had awakened Augustus was the sound of bones clicking and rattling as they slid down the sides of the pyramid. Augustus holstered his pistol and walked over to watch the old man. "You're an unusual fellow, Os," he said. "I guess you just work night and day. You should have partnered up with Woodrow Call. He's crazy about work as you are. Two of you might own the world by now if you'd hooked up." Os Frank didn't respond. He had emptied the wheelbarrow and he pushed it up the slope away from the river. Augustus caught his horse and rode east. On his way he saw Os Frank again, working under the moonlight. He had plenty to work with, for the plain around was littered with buffalo bones. It looked as if the whole herd had been wiped out, for a road of bones stretched far across the plain. He remembered when he had first come to the high plains years before. For 2 days he and Call and the Rangers had ridden parallel to the great southern buffalo herds, hundreds of thousands of animals slowly grazing north. It had been difficult to sleep at night because the horses were nervous around so many animals, and the sounds of the herd were constant. They had ridden for nearly 100 miles and seldom been out of sight of buffalo. Of course they had heard that buffalo were being wiped out, but with the memory of the southern herd so vivid, they had hardly credited the news. Discussing it in Lonesome Dove, they had decided that the reporters must be exaggerated, thinned out maybe, but not wiped out. Thus the sight of the road of bones stretching over the prairie was a shock. Maybe roads of bones were all that was left. The thought gave the very emptiness of the plains a different feel. With those millions of animals gone and the Indians mostly gone in their wake, the great plains were truly empty, unpeopled and ungrazed. Soon the whites would come, of course, but what he was seeing was a moment between, not the plains as they had been, or as they would be, but a moment of true emptiness, with thousands of miles of grass resting unused, occupied only by remnants of the buffalo, the Indians, the hunters. Augustus thought they were crazed remnants, mostly like the old mountain man who worked night and day gathering bones to no purpose. "No wonder you never worked out in Waco, Os," he said, speaking as much to himself as to the old man. Os Frank was not in a talkative mood, or a listening mood either. He had filled his wheelbarrow and was heading back to camp. "I'm going to the walls to kill that big renegade for you," Augustus said. "Need anything?" Os Frank stopped, as if thinking it over. "I wished I hadn't killed that dog," he said. "I liked that dog. It was them Kiowas that killed it, not the Mexicans. 6 Kiowas. "Well, I got 6 bullets," Augustus said. "Maybe I'll send the rascals where your dog went." "Them Kiowas shot Bob's horse," Os added. "That's how come they caught him, built a fire under him, and cooked him. That's their way." Then he lifted his wheelbarrow full of bones and walked off toward the Canadian River. The light was just coming, the plains black in the distance, the sky gray where it met the land. Though dawn was his favorite hour, it was also an hour in which Augustus most keenly felt himself to be a fool. What was it but folly to be riding along the Canadian River alone, easy pickings for an outlaw gang, and hungry to boot? A chain of follies had put him there. Call's abrupt decision to become a cattleman, and his own decision equally abrupt to try and rescue a girl foolish enough to be taken in by Jake Spoon. None of it was sensible, yet he had to admit there was something about such follies that he liked. The sensible way, which he had pursued once or twice in his life, had always proved boring, usually within a few days. In his case, it had led to nothing much, just excessive drunkenness and reckless card playing. There was more enterprise in certain follies, it seemed to him. As the sun lit the grass, he rode east along the road of the Buffalo Bones.